Okay, I am back finishing up middle childhood cognitive development looking at language. So here we are on the vocabulary, grammar, and pragmatic slide. Advances in language may not be as noticeable, right, than the first earliest of years, but nevertheless, language development is still dramatic during this middle childhood. Once they enter school, we're talking about beginning to read. So they're picking up new words at an extremely high rate through conversation, through reading. After formal schooling has begun, vocabulary, of course, is expanding greatly again through conversation, through exposure, through their reading abilities, and being involved in language and that individual level through reading. Of course, grammar becomes more complex. We're starting to see things like conditional sentences, like, if you borrow me that book, you can borrow me this descendant's book or whatever it might be. Or if you do this, I'll give you a cookie kind of stuff. So we're seeing conditional sentence, lots of more complicated grammar escalating here and learning about grammar. Pragmatics, remember pragmatics is what to say, when to say it, right? Sort of that social cultural aspect of language improves to a degree, right? We're seeing things like use of humor appropriately being executed here for kiddos. So pragmatics, again, understanding humor, using humor, we can see that improvement in pragmatics through humor. So dramatic vocabulary, grammar, pragmatic development happening. Let's move on to the next slide, a slide on multilingualism. All right, so a rising number of children around the world grow up knowing 2 or more languages. You see the map of the United States here, looking at the idea of being bilingual, so that's 2 languages. We're seeing this trend towards increased knowing more than 1 language, so we ask why. We look at why weren't we, why were we, look at us compared to other places in the world. So we look at things like increased migration, right? Increased global economy, different values that we're going to place in different changes in the world that are going to increase us to be speaking more than 1 language, and we'll see how that trajectory goes. So people, of course, want to know, okay, what do we know about learning a second language, especially for children? Overall, learning a second language is very beneficial. It's very favorable for the idea of language development in human beings. It does not interfere with mastering a primary language. That actually gives us better metalinguistic skills, which are basically the underlying idea of understanding language. When people learn, or children learn a second language, we are seeing better scores in their cognitive abilities. Their analytical reasoning scores are better. They're more cognitively flexible and more cognitively complex. So we have better scores when we're looking at general measures of cognitive development when we are learning more than 1 language. We also do see, and you've probably heard this, that it's easier to learn language in early childhood than later in life as an adult, and this is true. We believe it has to do with the biological readiness that we have to learn a language. Remember when we spoke on this about physically, evolutionary, all of the reasons we're set up to speak a language as a species. So learning a second language, overall, very favorable in language development, very favorable in cognitive development. So this is something interesting to look at as well. Next slide is school experiences and achievement. Most of the world today, the daily lives of middle childhood children in this age is oriented around school. This is typical, but this is not universal. Middle childhood, I refer to it as school age, right? It is the national norm here to be in school. And in developing country, there is a focus. Developing countries, there is a focus on children that's changing from work to school. So we are seeing that shift into more middle-aged children into school around the world. Let's see here. We're looking at different things on like comparing, research comparing schools here and other places in the world. We see like what we're spending our time in schools. Like Americans spend less time learning academic subjects, but we do spend more time in other countries than in like art, music, sports. We see differences in the length of the school day, the length of the school year. We have differences in what we pay attention to. Collectivist cultures are more about group conformity. There's more uniforms. There's more cleaning the school together. There's more group projects. Where in the U.S., we're more individualistic. We see education more as, okay, this is your ability. This is individual success. It's not necessarily hard work. It's you. So we believe education is more of an innate ability, individual success. So there's some differences when we look at that overlay of the sort of culture that we live in and then the type of school. We also see, of course, socioeconomic differences in the type of schooling opportunities you're going to have, the type of success that we have in schools. And we see a tie, of course, with context, right, with money and other variables. But schools funded through local property taxes are going to create a disparity in the types of school systems or schooling that you're going to receive. So socioeconomic context in developed countries is going to range the school experience and school achievement as well. Next slide, looking at cognitive skills of school and specifically reading. So most cultures, middle childhood, school-age childhood, we're learning to read. Of course, there's variation in time. There's variations in how we learn to read, how we acquire this skill, both within and between lots of cultures. But if we look at this idea of reading and learning to read, this is actually a relatively new development in the United States. 200 years ago, the majority of people were illiterate. So this concept of learning to read, reading as a cognitive skill, cognitive skills for school, these are relatively new concepts. But we have different approaches to reading, looking at this idea of the phonics approach, right? Breaking down words, breaking down letters into their sounds or phonics and putting those phonics back together into words, gradually more and more complex into structures of sentences and paragraphs, etc. There's that approach, the phonics approach. There's also the whole language approach, which is really focusing on written language, making that written language and reading to the children stories that really are interest to them, that make sense to them, and that's another way we can help kids read. They say research shows that the phonics approach is the best approach, is the most effective approach to teaching kiddos to read. So the phonics approach pretty much is the way that we're teaching kids mostly how to read today. Moving to the next slide about using mathematics as a skill, as a cognitive skill, as a cognitive way of schooling is kind of interesting and looking at that progression. So through childhood and middle childhood, the development of math skills follows a pretty parallel path when we're looking at how we develop language, how we develop to read. It parallels math right along with it. So by 2, I'm starting to count, By 3, 4, 5, I'm doing simple 1 plus 1 and getting more complicated addition, subtractions happening around 5. And then I keep advancing just like I do with my language and my other cognitive skills into multiplication, into division, into other more complicated math sort of skills. But one thing that's really interesting with math is it doesn't have to be, and same with reading, it doesn't have to be learned in formal schooling. We can see kiddos that are in middle childhood age that aren't in school for various circumstance. For instance, children that are on this living in the street in Brazil, they're selling candy. They know how to do subtraction and addition just fine, and they did not have formal schooling in how to do that. So these practical settings are a great way as well for us to learn math. It doesn't have to just be in school. So if I'm selling candy, I have to make change. I have to add things up. I have to use these math skills as a child, selling candy as one example around the world and some of the differences between schooling and then learning these skills. All right, that's it for cognitive development. Stop this video and then we're going to go into social emotional development. Thanks, guys.